Emotional irrationality. I just snapped, and those words are often part of an unfolding tragedy as a soldier irrationally responds to a provocative civilian, a physician to an entitled patient, or a parent to a misbehaving child. All of these situations are ones in which inappropriate anger and hostility are dealt out by tired, sleep-deprived individuals. Many of us know that inadequate sleep plays havoc with our emotions. We even recognize it in others. Consider another common scenario of a parent holding a young child who is screaming or crying and, in the mindset of the turmoil, turns to you and says, "Well, Stephen, you didn't get enough sleep last night." Universal parental wisdom knows that bad sleep the night before leads to a bad mood and emotional reactivity the next day. While the phenomenon of emotional irrationality following sleep loss is subjectively and anecdotally common, until recently we did not know how sleep deprivation influenced the emotional brain at a neural level. Despite the professional, psychiatric, and societal ramifications, several years ago, my team and I conducted a study using MRI brain scanning to address the question. We studied two groups of healthy young adults. One group stayed awake all night, monitored under full supervision in my laboratory, while the other group slept normally that night. During the brain scanning session the next day, participants in both groups were shown the same 100 pictures that ranged from neutral in emotional content, for example, a basket, a piece of driftwood, to emotionally negative, for example, a burning house, a venomous snake about to strike. Using these emotional gradients of pictures, we were able to compare the increase in brain response to the increasingly negative emotional triggers. Analysis of the brain scans revealed the largest effects I have measured in my research to date. A structure located in the left and right sides of the brain, called the amygdala, a key hotspot for triggering strong emotions such as anger and rage and linked to the fight or flight response, showed well over a 60% amplification in emotional reactivity in the participants who were sleep deprived. In contrast, the brain scans of those individuals who were given a full night's sleep evinced a controlled, modest degree of reactivity in the amygdala, despite viewing the very same images. It was though without sleep our brain reverts to a primitive pattern of uncontrolled reactivity. We produce unmeasured, inappropriate emotional reactions and are unable to place events into a broader or considered context. This answer raised another question. Why were the emotion centers of the brain so excessively reactive without sleep? Further MRI studies using more refined analysis allowed us to identify the root cause. After a full night of sleep, the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain that sits just above your eyeballs, is most developed in humans relative to other primates, and is associated with rational logical thought and decision-making, was strongly coupled to the amygdala, regulating this deep emotional brain center with inhibitory control. With a full night of plentiful sleep, we have a balanced mix between our emotional gas pedal amygdala and brake prefrontal cortex. Without sleep, however, the strong coupling between these two brain regions is lost. We cannot rein in our atavistic impulses. Too much emotional gas pedal, amygdala, and not enough regulatory brake, prefrontal cortex. Without the rational control given to us each night by sleep, we're not on a neurological and hence emotional even keel. Recent studies by a research team in Japan have now replicated our findings, but they've done so by restricting participants' sleep to 5 hours for 5 nights. No matter how you take sleep from the brain, acutely across an entire night or chronically by short sleeping for a handful of nights, the emotional brain consequences are the same. When we conducted our original experiments, I was struck by the pendulum-like swings in the mood and emotions of our participants. In a flash, sleep-deprived subjects would go from being irritable and antsy to punch-drunk giddy, only to then swing right back to a state of vicious negativity. They were traversing enormous emotional distances, from negative to neutral to positive, and all the way back again within a remarkably short period of time. It was clear that I had missed something. I needed to conduct a sister study to the one I described above, but now explore how the sleep-deprived brain responds to increasingly positive and rewarding experiences, such as exciting images of extreme sports or the chance of winning increasing amounts of money in fulfillment tasks. We discovered that different deep emotional centers in the brain just above and behind the amygdala, called the striatum, associated with impulsivity and reward and bathed by the chemical dopamine, had become hyperactive in sleep-deprived individuals in response to the rewarding, pleasurable experiences. As with the amygdala, the heightened sensitivity of these hedonic regions was linked to a loss of rational control from the prefrontal cortex. Insufficient sleep does not therefore push the brain into a negative mood state and hold it there. Rather, the underslept brain swings excessively to both extremes of emotional valence, positive and negative. You may think that the former counterbalances the latter, thereby neutralizing the problem. Sadly, emotions and their guidance of optimal decision and actions do not work this way. Extremity is often dangerous. Depression and extreme negative mood can, for example, infuse an individual with a sense of worthlessness, together with the ideas of questioning life's value. There is now clearer evidence of this concern. Studies of adolescents have identified a link between sleep disruption and suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, and tragically, suicide completion in the days after. One more reason for society and parents to value plentiful sleep in teens rather than chastity, especially considering that suicide is the second leading cause of death in young adults in developed nations after car accidents. Insufficient sleep has also been linked to aggression, bullying, and behavioral problems in children across a range of ages. A similar relationship between a lack of sleep and violence has been observed in adult prison populations, places that, I should add, are woefully poor at enabling good sleep that could reduce aggression, violence, psychiatric disruptions, and suicide, which, beyond the humanitarian concern, increases costs to the taxpayer. Equally problematic issues arise from extreme swings in positive mood, though the consequences are different. Hypersensitivity to pleasurable experiences can lead to sensation seeking, risk taking, and addiction. Sleep disturbance is a recognized hallmark associated with addictive substance use. Insufficient sleep also determines the relapse rates in numerous addiction disorders associated with reward cravings that are unmeasured, lacking control from the rational head office of the brain's prefrontal cortex. Relevant from a prevention standpoint, insufficient sleep during childhood significantly predicts early onset of drug and alcohol use in that same child during their later adolescent years, even when controlling for other high-risk traits such as anxiety, attention deficits, and parental history of drug use. You can now appreciate why the bidirectional pendulum-like emotional liability caused by sleep deprivation is so concerning, rather than counterbalancing. Our brain scanning experiments in healthy individuals offered reflections on the relationship between sleep and psychiatric illnesses. There is no major psychiatric condition in which sleep is normal. This is true of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD), schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, once known as manic depression. Psychiatry has long been aware of the coincidence between sleep disturbance and mental illness. However, a prevailing view in psychiatry has been that mental disorders cause sleep disruption, a one-way street of influence. Instead, we have demonstrated that otherwise healthy people can experience a neurological pattern of brain activity similar to that observed in many of these psychiatric conditions simply by having their sleep disrupted or blocked. Indeed, many of the brain regions commonly impacted by psychiatric mood disorders are the same regions that are involved in sleep regulation and impacted by sleep loss. Further, many of the genes that show abnormalities in psychiatric illnesses are the same genes that help control sleep and our circadian rhythms. Had psychiatry got the causal direction wrong, and it was sleep disruption instigating mental illness, not the other way around? No, I believe that is equally inaccurate and reductionist to suggest. Instead, I firmly believe that sleep loss and mental illness is best described as a two-way street of interaction, with the flow of traffic being stronger in one direction or the other depending on the disorder. I am not suggesting that all psychiatric conditions are caused by absent sleep. However, I am suggesting that sleep disruption remains a neglect favor contributing to the instigation and/or maintenance of numerous psychiatric illnesses, and has powerful diagnostic and therapeutic potential that we are yet to fully understand or make use of. Preliminary but compelling evidence is beginning to support this claim. One example involves bipolar disorder, which most people will recognize by the former name of maniac depression. Bipolar disorder should not be confused with major depression, in which individuals slide exclusively down into the negative end of the mood spectrum. Instead, patients with bipolar depression vacillate between both ends of the emotion spectrum, experiencing dangerous periods of mania, excessive reward-driving emotional behavior, and also periods of deep depression, negative moods, and emotions. These extremes are often separated by a time when the patients are in a stable emotional state, neither maniac nor depressed. A research team in Italy examined bipolar patients during the time when they were in the stable inter-episode phase. Next, under careful clinical supervision, they sleep-deprived these individuals for one night. Almost immediately, a large proportion of the individuals either spiraled into a maniac episode or become seriously depressed. I find it to be an ethically difficult experiment to appreciate, but the scientists had importantly demonstrated that a lack of sleep is a causal trigger of a psychiatric episode of mania or depression. The result supports a mechanism in which the sleep disruption, which almost always precedes the shift from a stable to an unstable maniac or depressive state in bipolar patients, may well be the trigger in the disorder and not simply epiphenomenal. Thankfully, the opposite is also true. Should you improve sleep quality in patients suffering from several psychiatric conditions using a technique we will discuss later called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, You can improve symptom severity and remission rates. My colleague at the University of California, Berkeley, Dr. Alison Harvey, has been a pioneer in this regard. By improving sleep quantity, quality, and regularity, Harvey and her team have systematically demonstrated the healing abilities of sleep for the minds of numerous psychiatric populations. She has intervened with the therapeutic toll of sleep on conditions as diverse as depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, and suicide, all to great effect. By regularizing and enhancing sleep, Harvey has stepped these patients back from the edge of crippling mental illness. That, in my opinion, is a truly remarkable service to humanity. The swings in emotional brain activity that we observed in healthy individuals who were sleep deprived may also explain a finding that has perplexed psychiatry for decades. Patients suffering from major depression, in which they become exclusively locked into the negative end of the mood spectrum, show that what at first appears to be a counterintuitive response to one night of sleep deprivation. Approximately 30 to 40% of these patients will feel better after a night without sleep. Their lack of slumber appears to be an antidepressant. The reason sleep deprivation is not a commonly used treatment, however, is twofold. First, as soon as these individuals do sleep, the antidepressant benefit goes away. Second, the 60 to 70% of patients who do not respond to the sleep deprivation will actually feel worse, deepening their depression. As a result, sleep deprivation is not a realistic or comprehensive therapy option. Still, it has posed an interesting question. How could sleep deprivation prove helpful for some of these individuals, yet detrimental to others? I believe that the explanation resides in the bidirectional changes in emotional brain activity that we observed. Depression is not, as you may think, just about the excess presence of negative feelings. Major depression has as much to do with absence of positive emotions, a theory described as anhedonia, the inability to gain pressure from normally pleasurable experiences such as food, socializing. The one-third of depressed individuals who respond to sleep deprivation may therefore be those who experience the greater amplification within reward circuits of the brain that I described earlier, resulting in far stronger sensitivity to and experiencing of positive rewarding triggers following sleep deprivation. Their anhedonia is therefore lessened, and now they can begin to experience a greater degree of pleasure from pleasurable life experiences. In contrast, the other two-thirds of depressed patients may suffer the opposite negative emotional consequences of sleep deprivation more dominantly, a worsening rather than alleviation of their depression. If we can identify what determines those who will be responders and those who will not, my hope is that we can create better, more tailored sleep intervention methods for combating depression. We will revisit the effects of sleep loss on emotional stability and other brain functions in later chapter when we discuss the real-life consequences of sleep loss in society, education, and the workplace. The findings justify our questioning of whether or not sleep-deprived doctors can make emotionally rational decisions and judgments. Underslept military personnel should have their fingers on the triggers of weaponry. Overworked bankers and stock traders can make rational, non-risky financial decisions when investing in public's hard-earned retirement funds. And if teenagers should be battling against impossibly early start times are in a developmental phase of life when they are most vulnerable to developing psychiatric disorders. For now, however, I will summarize this section by offering a discerning quote on the topic of sleep and emotion by the American entrepreneur E. Joseph Goldman. The best bridge between despair and hope is a good night's sleep. Tired and forgetful? Have you ever pulled an all-nighter, deliberately staying awake all night? One of my true loves is teaching a large undergraduate class on the science of sleep at the University of California, Berkeley. I, I taught a similar sleep course while I was at Harvard University. At the start of the course, I conduct a sleep survey inquiring about my students' sleep habits, such as the times they go to bed and wake up during the week and weekend, how much sleep they get, if they think their academic performance is related to their sleep. Inasmuch as they are telling me the truth, they fill the survey out anonymously online, not in class. The answer I routinely get is saddening. More than 85% of them pull all-nighters. Especially concerning is the fact that of those who said yes to pulling all-nighters, almost a third will do so monthly, weekly, or even several times a week. As the course continues throughout the semester, I return to the results of their sleep survey and link their own sleep habits with the science we are learning about. In this way, I try to point out the very personal dangers they face to their psychological and physical health due to their insufficient sleep, and the danger they themselves pose to society as a consequence. The most common reason my students give for pulling all-nighters is to cram for an exam. In 2006, I decided to conduct an MRI study to investigate whether they were right or wrong to do so. Was pulling an all-nighter a wise idea for learning? We took a large group of individuals and assigned them to either a sleep group or a sleep deprivation group. Both groups remained awake normally across the first day. Across the following nights, those in the sleep group obtained a full night of shut-eye, while those in the sleep deprivation group were kept awake all night under the watchful eye of trained staff from my lab. Both groups were then awake across the following morning. Around midday, we placed participants inside an MRI scanner and had them try to learn a list of facts, one at a time, as we took snapshots of their brain activity. Then we tested them to see how effective that learning had been. However, instead of testing them immediately after learning, we waited until they had had 2 nights of recovery sleep. We did this to make sure that any impairments we observed in the sleep-deprived group were not confounded by them being too sleepy or inattentive to recollect what they may very well have learned. Therefore, the sleep deprivation manipulation was only in effect during the act of learning and not during the later act of recall. When we compared the effectiveness of learning between the two groups, the result was clear. There was a 40% deficit in the ability of the sleep-deprived group to cram new facts into the brain, to make new memories, relative to the group that obtained a full night of sleep. To put that in context, it would be the difference between acing an exam and failing it miserably. What was going wrong within the brain to produce these deficits? We compared the patterns of brain activity during attempted learning between the two groups and focused our analysis on the brain region that we spoke about in Chapter 6, the hippocampus, the information inbox of the brain that acquires new facts. There was loss of healthy, learning-related activity in the hippocampus in the participants who had slept the night before. However, when we looked at this same brain structure in the sleep-deprived participants, we could not find any significant learning activity whatsoever. It was as though sleep deprivation had shut down their memory inbox and any new incoming information was simply being bounced. You don't even need the blunt force of a whole night of sleep deprivation, simply disrupting the depth of an individual's NREM sleep with infrequent sounds. Preventing deep sleep and keeping the brain in shallow sleep without waking the individual up will produce similar brain deficits and learning impairments. You may have seen a movie called Memento, in which the lead character suffers brain damage and from that point forward can no longer make any new memories. In neurology, he is what we call densely amnesic. The part of his brain that was damaged was the hippocampus. It is the very same structure that sleep deprivation will attack, blocking your brain's capacity for new learning. I cannot tell you how many of my students have come up to me at the end of the lecture in which I described these studies and said, I know that exact feeling. It seems as though I'm staring at the page of the textbook, but nothing is going in. I may be able to hold on to some facts the following day for the exam, but if you were to ask me to take that same test a month later, I think I'd hardly remember a thing. The later description has scientific backing. Those few memories you are able to learn while sleep deprived are forgotten far more quickly in the hours and days thereafter. Memories formed without sleep are weaker memories, evaporating rapidly. Studies in rats have found that it is almost impossible to strengthen the synaptic connections between the individual neurons that normally forge new memory circuits in the animals that have been sleep deprived. Imprinting lasting memories into the architecture of the brain becomes nearly impossible. This is true whether the researchers sleep deprived the rats for a full 24 hours or just a little for 2 or 3 hours. Even the most elemental units of the learning process, the production of proteins that form the building blocks of memories within these synapses, are stunned by the state of sleep loss. The very latest work in this area has revealed that sleep deprivation even impacts the DNA and the learning-related genes in the brain cells of the hippocampus itself. A lack of sleep, therefore, is a deeply penetrating and corrosive force that enfeebles the memory-making apparatus within your brain, preventing you from constructing lasting memory traces. It is rather like building a sandcastle too close to the tide line. The consequences are inevitable. While at Harvard University, I was invited to write my first op-ed piece for their newspaper, The Crimson. The topic was sleep loss, learning, and memory. It was also the last piece I was invited to write. In the article, I described the above studies and their relevance, returning time and again to the pandemic of sleep deprivation that was sweeping through the student's body. However, rather than lab state the students for these practices, I pointed a scolding finger directly at the faculty, myself included. I suggest that if we as teachers strive to accomplish just that purpose, to teach, then end loading exams in the final days of the semester was an asinine decision. It forced a behavior in our students, that of short sleeping or pulling all-nighters leading up to the exam, that was in direct opposition to the goals of nurturing young scholarly minds. I argued that logic backed by scientific facts must prevail, and that it was long past the time for us to rethink our evaluation methods, the contra-educational impact, and the unhealthy behavior it coerced from our students. To suggest that the reaction from the faculty was icy would be a thermal compliment. It was the student's choice, I was told in Adaman's response email. A lack of planned study by irresponsible undergraduates was another common rebuttal from faculty and administrators attempting to sidestep responsibility. In truth, I never believed that one op-ed column would trigger a U-turn in poor educational examination methods at that or any other higher institute of learning. As many have said about such stoic institutions, theories, beliefs, and practices die one generation at a time. But the conversation and battle must start somewhere. You may ask whether I have changed my own educational practice and assessment. I have. There are no final exams at the end of the semester in my classes. Instead, I split my courses up into thirds so that students only have to study a handful of lectures at a time. Furthermore, none of the exams are cumulative. It's a tried and true effect in the psychology of memory, described as mass versus spaced learning. As with a fine dining experience, it is far more preferable to separate the educational meal into smaller courses, with breaks in between to allow for digestion, rather than attempt to cram all of those informational calories down in one go. In Chapter 6, I described the crucial role for sleep after learning in the offline cementing or consolidating of recently learned memories. My friend and longtime collaborator at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Robert Siegel, conducted a clever study with wide-reaching implications. He had a total of 133 undergraduates learn a visual memory task through repetition. Participants then returned to his laboratory and were tested to see how much they had retained. Some subjects returned the next day after a full night of sleep. Others returned 2 days later after 2 full nights of sleep, and still others after 3 days with 3 nights of sleep in between. As you would predict by now, a night of sleep strengthened the newly learned memories, boosting their retention. Additionally, the more nights of sleep participants had before they were tested, the better their memory was. All except another subgroup of participants, like the subjects in the third group. These participants learned the task on the first day and learned it just as well. They were then tested 3 nights later, just like the third group both. The difference was that they were deprived of sleep the first night after learning and were not tested the following day. Instead, Stiggold gave them 2 full recovery nights of sleep before testing them. They showed absolutely no evidence of a memory consolidation improvement. In other words, if you don't sleep the very first night after learning, you lose the chance to consolidate those memories even if you get lots of catch-up sleep thereafter. In terms of memory, then sleep is not like the bank. You cannot accumulate a debt and hope to pay it off at a later point in time. Sleep for memory consolidation is an all or nothing event. It is a concerning result in our 24/7 hurry up, don't we society. I feel another op-ed coming on. And Alzheimer's disease. The two most feared diseases throughout developed nations are dementia and cancer. Both are related to inadequate sleep. We will address the latter in the next chapter regarding sleep deprivation and the body. Regarding the former, which centers on the brain, a lack of sleep is fast becoming recognized as a key lifestyle factor determining whether or not you will develop Alzheimer's disease. In addition, Originally identified in 1901 by German physician Dr. Aloysius Alzheimer, has become one of the largest public health and economic challenges of the 21st century. More than 40 million people suffer from the debilitating disease. That number has accelerated as the human lifespan has stretched, but also importantly, as total sleep time has decreased. 1 in 10 adults over the age of 65 now suffers from Alzheimer's disease. Without advances in diagnosis, prevention, and therapeutics, the escalation will continue. Sleep represents a new candidate for hope on all three of these fronts: diagnosis, prevention, and therapeutics. Before discussing why, let me first describe how sleep disruption and Alzheimer's disease are causally linked. As we learned in Chapter 5, sleep quality, especially that of deep and REM sleep, deteriorates as we age. This is linked to a decline in memory. However, if you assess a patient with Alzheimer's disease, the disruption of deep sleep is far more exaggerated. More telling, perhaps, is the fact that sleep disturbance precedes the onset of Alzheimer's disease by several years, suggesting that it may be an early warning sign of the condition, or even a contributor to it. Following diagnosis, the magnitude of sleep disruption will then progress in unison with the symptom severity of the Alzheimer's patient, further suggesting a link between the two. Making matters worse, over 60% of the patients with Alzheimer's disease have at least one clinical sleep disorder, insomnia especially common, as caregivers of a loved one with Alzheimer's disease will know all too well. It was not until relatively recently, however, that the association between disrupted sleep and Alzheimer's disease was realized to be more than just an association. While much remains to be understood, we now recognize that sleep disruption and Alzheimer's disease interact in a self-fulfillment negative spiral that can initiate and/or accelerate the condition. Alzheimer's disease is associated with the buildup of a toxic form of protein called beta-amyloid, which aggregates in sticky clumps or plaques within the brain. Amyloid plaques are poisonous to neurons, killing the surrounding brain cells. What is strange, however, is that amyloid plaques only affect some parts of the brain and not others, the reasons for which remain unclear. What struck me about this unexplained pattern was the location in the brain where amyloid accumulates early in the course of Alzheimer's disease and most severely in the late stages of the condition. That area is the middle part of the frontal lobe, which, as you will remember, is the same brain region essential for the electrical generation of deep and REM sleep in healthy young individuals. At that time, we did not understand if or why Alzheimer's disease caused sleep disruption, but simply knew that they always co-occurred. I wondered whether the reason patients with Alzheimer's disease have such impaired deep and REM sleep was in part because the disease erodes the very region of the brain that normally generate this key stage of slumber. I joined forces with Dr. William August, a leading authority on Alzheimer's disease at the University of California, Berkeley. Together, our research teams set about testing this hypothesis. Several years later, having assessed the sleep of many older adults with varying degrees of amyloid buildup in the brain that we quantified with a special type of PET scan, we arrived at the answer. The more amyloid deposits there were in the middle regions of the frontal lobe, the more impaired deep sleep quality was in that older individual. And it was not just as a general loss of deep sleep, which is common as we get older, but the very deepest of the powerful slow brainwaves of NREM sleep that the disease was ruthlessly eroding. This distinction was important, since it meant that the sleep impairment caused by amyloid buildup in the brain was more than just normal aging. It was unique, a departure from what is otherwise. It was unique, a departure from what is otherwise the signature of sleep decline as we get older. We are now examining whether this very particular dent in sleeping brainwave activity represents an early identifier of those who are at the greatest risk of developing Alzheimer's disease years in advance. If sleep does prove to be an early diagnostic measure, especially one that is relatively cheap, non-invasive, and can be easily obtained in a large number of individuals, unlike costly MRI or PET scans, then early intervention becomes possible. Building on these findings, our recent work has added a key piece in the jigsaw puzzle of Alzheimer's disease. We have discovered a new pathway through which amyloid plaques may contribute to memory decline later in life, something that has been largely missing in our understanding of how Alzheimer's disease works. I mentioned that the toxic amyloid deposits only accumulate in some parts of the brain and not others. Despite Alzheimer's disease being typified by memory loss, the hippocampus, that key memory reservoir in the brain, is mysteriously unaffected by amyloid protein. This question has so far baffled scientists. How does amyloid cause memory loss in Alzheimer's disease patients when amyloid itself does not affect memory areas of the brain? While other aspects of the disease may be at play, it seemed plausible to me that there was a missing intermediary factor, one that was transacting the influence of amyloid in one part of the brain on memory which depended on a different region of the brain. Was sleep disruption the missing factor? To test this theory, we had elderly patients with varying levels of amyloid. How low to high in their brains learn a list of new facts in the evening. The next morning, after recording their sleep in the laboratory that night, we tested them to see how effective their sleep had been at cementing and thus holding on to those new memories. We discovered a chain reaction effect. Those individuals with the highest levels of amyloid deposits in the frontal regions of the brain had the most severe loss of deep sleep and, as a knock-on consequence, failed to successfully consolidate those new memories. Overnight forgetting, rather than remembering, had taken place. The disruption of deep and REM sleep was therefore hidden middleman brokering the bad deal between amyloid and memory impairment in Alzheimer's disease, a missing link. These findings, however, were only half of the story, and admittedly the less important half. Our work had shown that the amyloid plaques of Alzheimer's disease may be associated with the loss of deep sleep, but does it work both ways? Can a lack of sleep actually cause amyloid to build up in your brain to begin with? If so, insufficient sleep across the individual's life would significantly raise their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. At the same time that we were conducting our studies, Dr. Macon Nedergaard at the University of Rochester made one of the most spectacular discoveries in the field of sleep research in the recent decades. Working with mice, Nedergaard found that a kind of sea-watch network called the lymphatic system exists within the brain. Its name is derived from the body's equivalent lymphatic system, but it's composed of cells called glia, from the Greek root word for glue. Glial cells are distributed throughout your entire brain, situated side by side with the neurons that generate the electrical impulses of your brain. Just as the lymphatic system drains contaminants from your body, the glymphatic system collects and removes dangerous metabolic contaminants generated by the hard work performed by neurons in your brain, that are like a support team surrounding an elite athlete. Although the glymphatic system, the support team, is somewhat active during the day, Nethergaard and her team discovered that it is during sleep that this neural sanitization work kicks into high gear. Associated with the pulsing rhythm of deep and REM sleep comes a 10 to 20-fold increase in affluent expulsion from the brain. In what can be described as a nighttime power cleanse, the purifying work of the glymphatic system is accomplished by cerebrospinal fluid that bathes the brain. Nethergaard made a second astonishing discovery, which explained why the cerebrospinal fluid is so effective in flushing out metabolic debris at night. The glial cells of the brain were shrinking in size by up to 60% during REM sleep, enlarging the space around the neurons and allowing the cerebrospinal fluid to proficiently clean out the metabolic refuse left by the day's neural activity. Think of the buildings of a large metropolitan city physically shrinking at night, allowing municipal cleaning crews easy access to pick up garbage strewn in the streets, followed by a good pressure jet treatment of every nook and cranny. When we wake up each morning, our brains can once again function efficiently thanks to this deep cleansing. So, what does this have to do with Alzheimer's disease? One piece of toxic debris evacuated by the glymphatic system during sleep is amyloid protein, the poisonous element associated with Alzheimer's disease. Other dangerous metabolic waste elements that have links to Alzheimer's disease are also removed by the cleaning process during sleep, including protein called tau, as well as stress molecules produced by neurons when they combust energy and oxygen during the day. Should you experimentally prevent a mouse from getting REM sleep, keeping it awake instead, there is an immediate increase in amyloid deposits within the brain. Without sleep, an escalation of poisonous Alzheimer's-related protein accumulates in the brain of the mice, together with several other toxic metabolites. Phrased differently, and perhaps more simply, wakefulness is low-level brain damage, while sleep is neurological sanitation. Nethergaard's findings completed the circle of knowledge that our findings had left unanswered. Inadequate sleep and the pathology of Alzheimer's disease interact in a vicious cycle. Without sufficient sleep, amyloid plaques build up in the brain, especially in deep sleep-generating regions, attacking and degrading them. The loss of deep and REM sleep caused by this assault therefore lessens the ability to remove amyloid from the brain at night, resulting in greater amyloid deposition. More amyloid, less deep sleep, more amyloid, and so on and so forth. From this cascade comes a prediction getting too little sleep across the adult lifespan will significantly raise your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Precisely this relationship has now been reported in numerous epidemiological studies, including those individuals suffering from sleep disorders such as insomnia and sleep apnea. Parenthetically, and unscientifically, I have always found it curious that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, two heads of state that were very vocal, if not proud, about sleeping only 4 to 5 hours a night, Both went on to develop the ruthless disease. The current U.S. President Donald Trump, also a vociferous proclaimer of sleeping just a few hours each night, may want to take note. A more radical and converse prediction that emerges from these findings is that by improving someone's sleep, we should be able to reduce their risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, or at least delay its onset. Tentative support has emerged from clinical studies in which middle and older age adults have had their sleep disorders successfully treated. As a consequence, their rate of cognitive decline slowed significantly and further delayed the onset of Alzheimer's disease by 5 to 10 years. My own research group is now trying to develop a number of viable methods for artificially increasing deep and REM sleep that could restore some degree of the memory consolidation function that is absent in older individuals with high amounts of amyloid in the brain. If we can find a method that is cost effective and can be scaled up to the population level for repeat use, my goal is prevention. Can we begin supplementing the decline in deep sleep of vulnerable members of society during midlife, many decades before the tipping point of Alzheimer's disease is reached, aiming to avert dementia risk later in life? It is an admittedly lofty ambition, and some would argue a moonshot research goal, but it is worth recalling that we already use this conceptual approach in medicine in the form of prescribing statins to high-risk individuals in their 40s and 50s to help prevent cardiovascular disease, rather than having to treat it decades later. Insufficient sleep is only one among several risk factors associated with Alzheimer's disease. Sleep alone will not be the magic bullet that eradicates dementia. Nevertheless, prioritizing sleep across the lifespan is clearly becoming a significant factor for lowering Alzheimer's disease risk.